In his book, Myth and Reality, Mircea Eliade has claimed that in modern societies, the prose narrative, especially the novel, has taken the place of the recitation of myths in traditional and popular societies. More than this, it is possible to dissect out the mythical structure of certain modern novels. In other words, to show the literary survival of great mythological themes and characters. From this point of view, we could say then that the modern passion for the novel expresses the desire to hear the greatest possible number of mythological stories desacralized or simply camouflaged under profane forms. I have started with this quotation in order to indicate where the emphasis of my title lies: Waverley and Jacobite Mythology. The words myth and mythology, a collection of myths, have long had a considerable range of meanings. The term Jacobite mythology seems to find itself most at home in the long-running debate between Whig and Tory historians about Jacobitism itself. Jacobite mythology in such a debate is a disparaging term, meaning a picturesque substitute for history. But if we separate the words in the phrase so that it reads a mythology which is in this instant Jacobite, we shall come nearer to Eliade's meaning, a paradigmatic story. Such exemplary stories or myths are found in pre-literate societies. It may be suggested that their modern descendants are sometimes reworkings of the old themes in modern contexts, and sometimes are new creations, what may be called modern myths. The word myth has had from classical times a range of meanings. Either a myth is basically a lie, a fiction that deceives, that is less true than history, or it is a fiction that is more true than history, because it adumbrates a pattern which can be found repeatedly to exist behind the multiplicity of historical facts. Well, my difficulty is that the word myth in relation to Jacobitism has been used almost exclusively in the sense a delusive fiction, and by Whig historians. Theirs is the history of the winning side, and its bias is well known. It is that the Jacobite risings of the 18th century never had a chance of success, and that the values of a modern civil state are better protected by their defeat. Their view is that those who claim to be Jacobite are consoling themselves for defeat with a false and self-gratifying view of history. Typically, Jacobites fear the certainty of Whigs, and Whigs are exasperated at the waywardness of Jacobites. This view of Jacobitism has, however, been challenged by several historians in the last few years. It is certainly now less fashionable, to use no stronger word, to apply the term myth in the sense of delusive fiction to 18th century Jacobitism as a whole, although it may still be applied to some of its details. But what about myth in its less disparaging sense? A paradigmatic story which has entered into tradition. We don't owe our ideas on this to historians, but to structural anthropologists, and these ideas are perhaps less subject to shifts in politics. I wish to explore the Jacobite mythology in Scott's first novel, Waverley, or 'Tis 60 Years Since, using, if I can, the full range of meanings of the term, the serious as well as the disparaging. The serious use of myth is not an entirely unfamiliar way of reading Waverley. Critics concentrating on the career of the hero have pointed to Edward Waverley's journey into Scotland and participation in the Jacobite Rising of 1745 as a narrative of growing up, a story of initiation. Young people going out into the world for the first time were common in novels during most of the 18th and 19th centuries, and it was not necessary that they should have their adventures in a historical setting. Waverley has a rich vein of myth in it because of its Jacobite subject matter. It draws on the mythological elements in Jacobitism itself. To make my meaning clear, let me give you the Jacobite myth of the 45 as it might be recounted by an anthropologist. This is an abstract of the myth of the 45 as it is present in Waverley. The true king has been dispossessed from his kingdom. In an attempt to regain it, he sends his son to the country he has lost. The son is brave and inspires a band of followers who had been loyally awaiting his arrival for many years. They fight a campaign which starts with success but ends with defeat in battle. Many of the prince's followers die, either on the battlefield or later. But the prince himself escapes, again under the protection of loyal followers. During the years of waiting for his return, his followers, subject to oppression by the usurper, have their symbol of the white rose, their emotional outlet in song, and their memorial act in the rituals of drinking and the value attached to the drinking cup. Well, I have tried to tell, as an anthropologist might, the story of Prince Charles Edward Stuart arriving in Scotland from France in 1745 to attempt to gain the throne of Britain from the Hanoverian King George II on behalf of his father James. It is the story of his initial military success and eventual defeat at Culloden, from which the prince managed, after many adventures, to escape back to France. Well, I have tried to put my case simply to suggest that there is a Jacobite myth in Waverley. I now want to examine the different elements of my outline in more detail. It may be admitted that what I have recounted is present in Waverley, but to account for our experience as readers, we have to ask what else there is in Waverley, and, more difficult, what else there is in the Jacobitism of Scott's day that might have been in the novel, but is not. One problem in looking at Waverley is that the Jacobite myth was further elaborated later in the 19th century. I shall try to look at Waverley from the vantage point of 1814, the date of publication, although Scott admitted to having started to write it many years before. Let me consider then the elements of the Jacobite myth as they appear in Waverley. The first is the sense that the story is about a true king or a true prince. It is about legitimacy. The chief argument for monarchy is that it determines the legitimate heir, for instance by male primogeniture. If you are going to retain monarchy and select the monarch by some other criterion, then monarchy is seriously undermined. Legitimacy is a right transcending circumstance. To what extent does Scott present Prince Charles as the true prince? The novel is told largely from the viewpoint of the hero, Edward Waverley. His first introduction to the royalty of the Stuarts is in the sense of a shared secret, of excitement, of life about to be wrought to its highest pitch, but that is perceptible in the Jacobite households he visits. Throughout, there are two interpretations of this behavior. Is it part of the mystique surrounding royalty, or is it the secrecy surrounding what is illegal? The truth is hidden because the Jacobites have already been defeated before the novel starts in 1715. Jacobitism is a secret faith, requiring loyalty and self-sacrifice from its followers, and one day to assert itself in glory. At the end of Volume 2, Chapter 16, Edward Waverley, after a series of adventures, finds himself at Holyrood in September 1745, during Prince Charles's residence in the palace of the Scottish kings. The hero's meeting with the prince is described thus. Ere he knew where he was conducted, Edward found himself in a presence room fitted up with some attempt at royal state. A young man, wearing his own fair hair, distinguished by the dignity of his mien and the notable expression of his well-formed and regular features, advanced out of a circle of military gentlemen and Highland chiefs by whom he was surrounded. In his easy and graceful manners, Waverley afterwards thought he could have discovered his high birth and rank, although the star on his breast and the embroidered garter at his knee had not appeared as its indications. Waverley has a brief interview with the prince, and the consequence is this. Waverley, kneeling to Charles Edward, devoted his heart and sword to the vindication of his right. The narrator continues in a tone of grave respect. The prince, for although unfortunate in the faults and follies of his forefathers, we shall here and elsewhere give him the title due to his birth, raised Waverley from the ground and embraced him with an expression of thanks too warm not to be genuine. Scott is here following the lead of James Boswell, who went so far as to obtain the consent of George III to his using the title Prince for Charles Edward in his tour to the Hebrides with Samuel Johnson, published in 1785. The scene in which Edward Waverley meets the prince in Holyrood seems to me to be Jacobite. The hero is shown answering the call of legitimacy, which transcends other arguments. We might recall Scott's letter of 1813, in which he wrote, "Seriously, I am very glad I did not live in 1745, for though as a lawyer I could not have pleaded Charles's right, and as a clergyman I could not have prayed for him, yet as a soldier I would, I am sure, against the convictions of my better reason, have fought for him, even to the bottom of the gallows." In Waverley, Prince Charles is presented as royal in Scotland. It is only on his march into England that his royalty leaves him and he becomes a young man who is the victim of conflicting pressures. But it must be admitted that there is ambivalence in the most legitimist scene in the novel. Just before Edward's audience with the prince, we have his entry into Holyrood Palace. A long gallery hung with pictures pretended to be the portraits of kings who, if they ever flourished at all, lived several hundred years before the invention of painting in oil colours, served as a sort of guard chamber or vestibule to the apartments which the adventurous Charles Edward now occupied in the palace of his ancestors. This is a reference to a series of paintings of the Scottish kings, commissioned by the prince's great-uncle Charles II, from a Dutch artist, Jacob de Vet. The narrator's choice of words is ominous. Hung with pictures pretended to be the portraits of kings. The word pretended there unhappily echoes the Hanoverian name for the prince, the pretender. The problem of naming the prince is well illustrated in Waverley in an exchange between Waverley, the hero, and the Hanoverian officer whom he takes captive, Colonel Talbot. On Waverley's obtaining for him a passport, Talbot says, "I never thought to have been so much indebted to the prince," said Waverley, smiling. "To the Chevalier," said the Colonel. "It's a good travelling name, which we may both freely use." Well, that is a fair compromise. But there are other instances where the legitimacy of the prince is subverted in the novel by language. I shall give a couple of instances which are used by Jacobites. The first is the adjective unfortunate, the unfortunate prince. That is a favourite adjective of Boswell's, and he found it before him in Voltaire. It may be an emotional appeal for our sympathy, but it undermines the claim of legitimacy to show it subject to earthly fortunes. Another term which seems to me ambivalent is that of adventurer. the adventurous Charles Edward, the royal adventurer. This term is part of the code language which is generated by either the sacred, the divine that will not be named, or that which is hidden for safety. The royal adventurer. An adventurer is one who engages in hazardous enterprises, a soldier of fortune, a gambler. It plays off uncertainly, I think, with the adjective royal. Charles is royal, the representative of his father. The Duke of Cumberland is also royal, the son of George II. Not royal enough, I dare say. But he is not presented as a plenipotentiary of his father, but as an experienced and tough military leader. These two are princes, but the novel presents one as royal and the other as efficient. Legitimacy is with Charles. Well, I've said something about the true prince. The true prince is brave. There are plenty of instances in literature of the bravery of princes. One of the most surprising is that Hamlet should be able to match Laertes with a rapier. As a Wittenberg undergraduate in existential crisis, he ought to have been out of practice. As true prince, he has to be able to fight when necessary, just as Prince Hal had done. Prince Charles is brave, meaning personally and militarily brave. He put himself at the head of the advance. At the outset of the battle at Preston Pans, the narrator says this: "The few horse whom the prince headed in person remained between the two lines. The adventurer had intimated a resolution to charge in person at the head of his first line, but his purpose was deprecated by all around him, and he was, though with difficulty, induced to abandon it." As a true prince, he exists to be brave, and if he is argued out of it, his royalty will suffer. This is because he enters into a mythical inheritance, that of the brave versus the prudent. It is a story told by Homer of Odysseus and Achilles. It is in the Chanson de Roland, where Roland is brave and Olivier is prudent. In such stories, the brave man is old-fashioned. His followers are staunch, armed, and ready. The prudent man is modern and on the side of peace. The story of the brave versus the prudent is enacted in Waverley in both the historical plot and in the life of the hero. At the outset of the novel, Edward Waverley has fantasies about military bravery. At his uncle's house, he would rehearse the guards of the broadsword with an ancient brand of old Sir Hildebrand, which, being preserved as an heirloom, usually hung over the chimney in the library. Waverley takes down a sword that had been prudently hung over the chimney to practice some military flourishes with it. At his audience with Prince Charles, however, he is given a sword, and one with an epic ancestry, which he is expected to use seriously. "At least," said the prince, "allow me the pleasure of arming you after the Highland fashion." With these words, he unbuckled the broadsword which he wore, the belt of which was plated with silver, and the steel basket hilt richly and curiously inlaid. "The blade," said the prince, "is a genuine Andrea Ferrara. It has been a sort of heirloom in our family, but I am convinced I put it into better hands than my own, and will add to it pistols of the same workmanship." Waverley had sworn allegiance to Prince Charles in a torrent of mixed emotions. He goes on to fight at the Battle of Preston Pans, to join the Jacobite march into England as far as Derby, and to take part in the skirmish where the retreating Jacobites fought their pursuers at Clifton near Penrith. In the dark, in the turmoil of battle, Waverley is separated from the Jacobite army and takes refuge in a farmhouse near Ullswater. There he has time on his own to think out the consequences of his allegiance. Is Waverley the only work of the Romantic period that presents the Lake District as a place where young men may be left to kick their heels until they are cured of romantic fantasies? Waverley decides not to attempt to rejoin the Jacobite army, and devotes the rest of the novel to trying to help his Jacobite friends in their distresses. At the end of the novel, he marries Rose Bradwardine, and the sword given him by Prince Charles is hung on the wall of the matrimonial home. He is given a sword, an invitation into the world of bravery. At the end, the sword is returned to the wall, as his ancestor Sir Hildebrand's had been. Let me move on to another aspect of the Jacobite myth: defeat. In the 45, the Jacobites were defeated. While many of his loyal supporters are killed in battle or by government reprisal, the prince himself survives. How is that presented in Waverley? The story of the Jacobite campaign is presented through Edward Waverley, and therefore we lose a detailed account of it after he is separated from the army at Clifton in December 1745. News of the Jacobite army's retreat further and further into Scotland, and its defeat at Culloden in April of 1746, is given only as Waverley hears of it. It was on his return to Scotland that he heard the news. He reached the borders of Scotland. Here he heard the tidings of the decisive battle of Culloden. It was no more than he had long expected, though the success at Falkirk had thrown a faint and setting gleam over the arms of the Chevalier. Yet it came upon him like a shock, by which he was for a time altogether unmanned. The generous, the courteous, the noble-minded adventurer was then a fugitive with a price upon his head. His adherents, so brave, so enthusiastic, so faithful, were dead, imprisoned, or exiled. The escape of Charles is mentioned twice again, once between Waverley and the Baron of Bradwardine, and on the final meeting between Waverley and Fergus MacIver. It is, I think, significant that so little is said in Waverley about the escape of Charles. The escape had become an important part of the story because of the adventure in eluding government forces, the fact that none of the prince's Highland escorts was tempted by the £30,000 reward to betray him, and because of the part played in it by Flora Macdonald. The story of Flora Macdonald was popular in the 1740s when she was taken to London for trial for her part in the prince's escape, but allowed to go free. It was well enough known in the 1770s for Dr. Johnson to be moved by shaking her hand on his journey to the Western Isles in 1773. But his companion, Boswell, did more than anyone to preserve the story of the prince's escape. Boswell seems to have given popularity to yet another name for the prince, the Wanderer. And it is, of course, the story of the escape that gives particular significance to the Western Isles of Scotland as places of especial loyalty. None of that is in Waverley. So a large part of the romantic story of the 45 is not mentioned in Waverley. All that is to do with the escape. I think that makes the mythical pattern rather plainer. I have talked already about the brave versus the prudent. In tales on this theme, the brave man is defeated and killed. His death may be presented as noble, and his defeat seen to involve immense loss. But it is death. In Waverley, that death, the death of the noble warrior, is the death of the Highland chieftain Fergus MacIver, not, of course, of Charles. Prince Charles, as I have stressed, represents his father, the king, and legitimacy does not die. The attention is off the prince at the end of Waverley, but it is made quite plain that he was defeated but not killed, and that he escaped. The fact of escape allows for hope that he might come back. And that introduces another motif, the motif of restoration or return. I shall use these two words to mean two rather different things. At least until 1745, the Stuart kings might have been restored, as Charles II had been restored in 1660. As the century proceeded, however, the possibility of restoration became less likely, and the more mysterious concept of return starts to take over. It is the idea of the once and future king. Return seems to mean that either through not dying or through having their power renewed in someone else, the Stuart claimant might come back. In the literature of these islands, the most famous instance of this is King Arthur. In Sir Thomas Malory's famous words, "Yet some men say, in many parts of England, that King Arthur is not dead. And among those who thought he was, many men say that there is written upon his tomb this, Hic jacet Arturus, rex quondam rexque futurus." There are other examples of the leader who is to return in the Middle East. In Europe, it was believed that Frederick Barbarossa, who died in 1189, would return. It is interesting to note that in Waverley, the Baron of Bradwardine, explaining to Edward Waverley the origin of his heraldic crest, the rampant bear, traces it to a concession of arms of Frederick Redbeard, Emperor of Germany, to my predecessor Godmund Bradwardine. The myth of the future return or restoration of the Stuart kings was best known to Scott through his own family. His great-grandfather, also a Walter Scott, was a Jacobite and taken prisoner at Preston in 1715. He was known as Beardy because of his refusal to shave his beard until the Stuarts should be restored. There are other stories of this kind, such as that the gates of Traquair, from which Scott seems to have derived a detail for Tullyvearlan, will not be opened until the restoration of a Stuart monarch. Well, how much of this is in Waverley? In one sense, there is little scope for it, as the novel ends within months of Culloden. Yet it had been present throughout all the early scenes of the novel, as Waverly meets those who respond to the memory of the 15 with the hope of return. Jacobitism, in the sense of legitimacy, is defeated at the end of Waverly, but not dead. It dies for Scott in Red Gauntlet, when, on a final return, the Stuart claimant is not even thought worth conquering. The Jacobite myth, as I have been considering it, lacks any women characters. Like several myths, it gets its chief woman character rather late. Maid Marian is a late entrant into the Robin Hood myth. And Flora Macdonald comes late into the Jacobite myth. Presumably, she gives her Christian name to the Jacobite heroine of Waverly, Flora Macdonald. It is well known that the ladies of Edinburgh supported Prince Charles during his occupation of the city. In Waverly, women are among the most loyal Jacobites. At Waverley Honour, Aunt Rachel's loyalty is less dormant than her brother's, and some Jacobite expressions in a letter have awkward consequences for her nephew. When Edward enters the Whig village of Cairnvreckan, he finds the blacksmith's wife a Jacobite. The Jacobitism of these women characters could be regarded as belittling. Jacobitism seen as a leftover faith which was still observed by a few women who had not had either the opportunity or the necessity to confront modern political realities. Perhaps Aunt Rachel is of that sort. Or she could be a Jacobite out of a desire for self-assertion, or simply pure contrariness, like the Jacobite's wife, the blacksmith's wife. But these characters are foils for Flora Macdonald. She represents the true loyalty to the legitimate monarch and the legitimate religion. The only criticism made of her is made by Colonel Talbot. On hearing that Waverley is to marry Rose rather than Flora, he says, "Simplicity may be improved, but pride and self-conceit never." Legitimacy is a stubborn argument because it allows for no debate. At the end of Waverley, her brother is put to death, and Flora leaves Scotland for a convent in Paris. Flora is too grand, or too uncompliant, for marriage. In terms of the Jacobite myth, however, she represents the legitimate faith in its purest form. And like the true prince, she is not killed in the general defeat, but escapes. The Jacobites, who believe in the true succession, have no succession in Waverley. The Macivers have no heirs. Sir Everard Waverley is unmarried, and his heir is the son of a Hanoverian father. The Baron of Bradwardine has a daughter, but according to his view of feudal tenures, she is not allowed to succeed. I am reminded of Boswell's insistence on calling Flora Macdonald Miss Flora Macdonald, even though she had been married several years by the time Boswell met her. As I have suggested, waiting is part of the Jacobite myth, waiting for restoration or return. And certain motifs seem to have developed in connection with waiting. One is a certain kind of song, the Jacobite lyric, which has a memorial function. Scott gives Davy Gallatley, the chief singer in the novel, songs, either written by himself or adapted, which are Jacobite in their context. But these are not the same, I think, as the Jacobite memorial lyric. One might not expect such lyrics to occur in a novel set in 1745. They have been thought to date from later in the century, a view recently challenged by Murray Pittock's discovery of manuscript Jacobite song collections. In Waverley, however, there are one or two quotations from the Jacobite Memorial lyric, but they are in contexts which modify the song's apparent meaning. Let me give an example. William Donaldson has pointed out that the motif of the Highland Laddie in song in the course of the 18th century gained a Jacobite meaning. The Highland Laddie became Charles. On his way south from Glenacoich, the Highland home of the MacIvors, Waverley's horse loses a shoe and he is forced to ask for help in a lowland Whig village. Ere Waverley could ask particulars, a strong, large-boned, hard-featured woman, about 40, dressed as if her clothes had been flung on with a pitchfork, her cheeks flushed with a scarlet red where they were not smutted with soot and lamp black, jostled through the crowd, and brandishing high a child of 2 years old, which she danced in her arms without regard to its screams of terror, sang forth with all her might, "Charlie is my darling, my darling, my darling. Charlie is my darling, the young Chevalier." The singer of that snatch of one of the most romantic of Jacobite songs is Mrs. Muckleroth, wife of the village blacksmith. The song has several sets of words, of which the most famous is that by Burns, but there are others by Hogg and Lady Nairn. The song is in the tradition which links the wait for the return of Prince Charles to that of a girl waiting for the return of her lover. Scott quotes "Charlie is my darling" in a situation in which any romance, however, is seriously undermined. Mrs. Muckleroth does not sing enough of the song, she only sings the refrain of it, for us to be certain which version she was singing. At first sight, it is the words by Lady Nairn which are most suitable, as they stress the coming of Prince Charles at the head of an army. They fit the political moment in the novel perfectly. The song is therefore being sung in order to annoy the Whig villagers. But Burns's words to this tune are more complex and envisage the young Chevalier coming not just to Oortoon, but into the singer's bedroom. It is the motif of the lowland girl and the Highland lover. In Waverley, "Charlie is my darling" is sung by a redoubtable matron brandishing her 2-year-old child. As the scene goes on to make plain, the paternity of the child is somewhat in doubt. The Jacobite Highland Laddie motif is here cited not for its romantic potential, but as a way of settling domestic scores. The Jacobite Memorial lyric tends to feminize Jacobitism in creating songs with a female singer addressed to Prince Charles. The memorial act which remains firmly masculine is drinking, with its rituals of toasts, special drinking vessels, and the readiness to take offence if any participant speaks or acts improperly. In Waverley there is the Blessed Bear of Bradwardine, the Baron's golden goblet. But I think that the drinking ritual is also undercut as it is presented in the novel. The chief scene is that in Lucky Macleary's inn on the evening of Waverley's first arrival at Tullyvearlan. The Jacobite Laird of Balmawhapple gets roaring drunk and draws Waverley into a quarrel over his black cockade, his insignia as a Hanoverian officer. Flora McIver later gives the verdict on such episodes. Waiting for the return of the rightful king can be presented as a romantic thing. but in practice it imposes serious strains. Those who had been out in the 15 had suffered legal penalties, poverty, and limitation of society. In the present time, the gentlemen whose principles do not permit them to pay court to the present government are neglected and degraded, and may conduct themselves accordingly, and like some of the persons you have seen at Tullyvearlan, adopt habits and companions inconsistent with their birth and breeding. Something should be said about the Jacobite terrain in the novel, the Highlands. To Waverly, the distant Highlands, which at first had appeared a blue outline in the horizon, now swelled into huge, gigantic masses which frowned defiance over the more level country that lay beneath them. The Highlands in Waverly are on the far side of the pass of Ballybruff. In the novel, the first crossing of the pass had been by the Highlanders from the Highland side, and the mission was to steal the Baron's cattle. Not a good omen for future hostile eruptions. There are other things in the novel which are properly Highland, but in Waverly function as Jacobite. An example is the speaking of Gaelic. Edward Waverley is injured at the Jacobite hunting party by his failure to understand a warning uttered in Gaelic. Prince Charles, unlike Edward Waverley, is described as learning some Gaelic. The real Jacobite song in the novel, one which is not subverted by its context, is the Gaelic one sung by the bard at Glennaquoich. Another example is the wearing of tartan. Evan Dhew's appearance in Highland dress on an emissary over the pass to the Baron of Bradwardine is Waverley's first experience of dress which is to become for him Jacobite dress. When he joins the Jacobite army, he has appropriate dress made for him. Trews with a tartan plaid and a blue bonnet of the prince's pattern. The last we hear of Waverley's Highland dress is that a painting of him wearing it hung beside the arms he was given by Prince Charles. This does seem to be a deceptive part of the Jacobite myth projected by the novel, that Highland and Jacobite are the same thing. Scott, as narrator, denies this, but the plot incidents imply it. The Jacobite myth puts stress on loyalty, on the staunch supporter. In the Jacobite Highlands, the loyalty of the chiefs to Prince Charles is mirrored in the loyalty of the clansmen to the chiefs. And one of the indicators of loyalty is dress. It proclaims whose man you are. In Waverley, that signal is given by the wearing of tartan. On his first appearance, Fergus MacIver is described as wearing the trews or close trousers made of tartan, checked scarlet and white. There is a class distinction in the dress in the novel. The chief wears trews and his followers the kilt. The scarlet and white MacIver tartan is worn by all his clansmen. Waverley notes that Fergus was particularly strict in requiring from his followers that they should wear the tartan striped in the mode peculiar to their race. Now here we are in mythical territory. Modern historians of dress doubt whether tartan was attached to an individual clan in the mid-18th century, and suspect that patterns were more likely to be associated with place. Scott thought, on the evidence of what he had heard from the older generation, that the powerful clans had clan tartans. The MacIvers in their red and white tartan no doubt played a part in the 19th century marshalling of tartans under names. But one can't help wondering whether that whole movement was not Jacobite inspired. in that it is celebrating a badge of allegiance, of belonging. Highland dress and the clan tartan are Jacobite in Waverley. But there is a more specific symbol of Jacobitism in the white rose. The origins of this emblem are particularly hard to trace, but by the second half of the 18th century, the white rose was in use as a Jacobite symbol in song, paintings, and in glass engraving, especially the engraving of drinking glasses. The symbol was there for use, and Scott in Waverley uses it twice, both times to refer, with slight irony, to Jacobite followers. The Jacobite women of Edinburgh who, like a brave soldier, are our beauties of the white rose. And those in the northwest of England who failed to join the Jacobite army have been supposed to be devoted to the cause of the white rose. The romance of the white rose does not, I think, derive from Scott. Scott was historian and realist enough to recognize that whatever may be claimed for clan tartans or white roses, the poorer members of the Jacobite army would simply come in what they stood up in, and that these wild-looking men would bring terror of an entirely unromantic sort to any lowlanders they met. To give unity to an army consisting of such disparate forces, the Jacobites wore white rosettes, knots of ribbon to identify their side. The choice of colour probably derived from the symbol of the white rose. It was in any case clearly distinct from the Hanoverian black. The white rosette figures in a scene in Waverley where the hero finds Flora making what he takes to be white bridal favours. These she is making to distribute to the clan. And most significant in the scene is that she refuses to give one to him. He is not given the badge of the true follower. I have tried to show that there is a myth in Waverley, a paradigmatic story, a story diagnostic of our thoughts and experiences which draws on archetypal motifs. Yet the novel is a historical novel dealing with a period of just under 2 years, from the autumn of 1744 to some months after Culloden. It was the work of a historian who was using historical sources as the corrective of detail as he wrote. The reader's experience of Jacobite mythology in Waverley is of the archetypal meeting the contingent, of the mythical elements that I have tried to diagnose coming up against the specific events of history. History, the succession of events in time, tends to look forward. Myth tends to look backward. It is the function of any paradigm to draw our mind backwards because it suggests that a configuration of events has happened before. Myths involving kingship are doubly likely to seem backward-looking because legitimacy usually involves transmission, and transmission looks back as well as forward. The coming together of myth, history, and Waverley creates a tension between looking forward and looking back. The confrontation between a king or a prince whose claim to rule is that of legitimacy and a ruler selected on different principles, ostensibly efficiency, but perhaps power, that is a motif that seems modern, but is actually ancient enough. It is the theme of the debate between Jesus and Pilate, according to St. John's Gospel. In the literature of the British Isles, the most celebrated instance is the debate between Richard II and Bolingbroke in Shakespeare's Richard II. Each time it seems a debate between the old and the new. The modern bureaucrat apparently wins, but the value lies elsewhere. The Jacobite kingship myth in Waverley is not, however, in the forefront of the novel. Charles is not presented in debate with any Hanoverian. The debate in the novel over who should rule is enacted in a plot involving young Edward Waverley and characters who put the Jacobite and Hanoverian points of view. When Waverley is deprived of his commission, Fergus MacIver urges him to seek vengeance on the government. Yes, upon the usurping house of Hanover, whom your grandfather would no more have served than he would have taken wages of red-hot gold from the great fiend of hell. Waverley replies to this, but since the time of my grandfather, 2 generations of this dynasty have possessed the throne. That argument weighs nothing with Fergus. Is the case of the unfortunate Stuart family become less just because their title has devolved upon an heir who is innocent of the charges of misgovernment brought against his father? Waverley comes in contact with a thoroughgoing Hanoverian when he takes Colonel Talbot prisoner at Preston Pans. Talbot reproaches Waverley with this, and so you have been trepanned into the service of this Italian knight-errant by a few civil speeches from him and 1 or 2 of his Highland recruiting sergeants. Well, both Fergus and Talbot use the argument from legitimacy. For Fergus, the Hanoverians are the usurping house of Hanover. For Talbot, Prince Charles is an Italian knight-errant. Well, the Italian is in part justified by his having an Italian grandmother and having been born in Rome. But it is basically a piece of rhetoric to deny him his hereditary right as the Stuart heir. And for Talbot, the Jacobite clan chiefs who supported Prince Charles are diminished to his Highland recruiting sergeants. But emerging from these debates is not just the argument from legitimacy, but also the argument adumbrated by Waverley when he interposed to Fergus, but since the time of my grandfather, 2 generations of this dynasty have possessed the throne. Now that is not an argument from legitimacy. One might call it an argument from time. In Waverley, Prince Charles may appear in a kingly scene in Holyrood and act as a brave fighter and magnanimous victor, but after that he is out of the novel. The argument is not solely one of legitimacy, it is also the argument from time. The subtitle of the novel, "'Tis 60 Years Since," takes the reader from the time of the commencement of writing to the 45. But there is another span of not quite 60 years, which is significant in the novel. The period from the Revolution of 1688, when the break in the true line of royal succession began, until the period at which the novel is set. Edward Waverley, trying to think out for himself the rights and wrongs of the Jacobite cause, thinks this. Whatever were the original rights of the Stuarts, calm reflection told him that, omitting the question how far James II could forfeit those of his posterity, he had, according to the united voice of the whole nation, justly forfeited his own. Since that period, 4 monarchs had reigned in peace and glory over Britain, sustaining and exalting the character of the nation abroad and its liberties at home. Reason asked, was it worthwhile to disturb a government so long settled and established, and to plunge a kingdom into all the miseries of civil war, to replace upon the throne the descendants of a monarch by whom it had been wilfully forfeited? That is no Jacobite speaking. It is an un-Jacobite reflection in its willingness to omit the key question of legitimacy, omitting the question how far James II could forfeit those of his posterity. But it asks the time question, not what should have happened in 1688, but what it is appropriate to try to bring about now, 60 years later. We have no difficulty in seeing this as a modern problem. It occurs to anyone who reflects, for instance, on the drawing of the national boundaries of several Middle Eastern states, many of them 60 years since. Waverley is true to both his Jacobite uncle and Hanoverian father in his views. Perhaps the son of James VII and II should not have been denied his rights of succession. But in the 60 years during which this wrong has not been reversed, other rights have developed, particularly the rights of the people to be spared civil war in an old cause. With views like this, Edward Waverley should never have thought of joining the Jacobite army. His views are the same as Samuel Johnson's, as recorded by Boswell. Mr. Johnson is not properly a Jacobite. He does not hold the jus divinum of kings. He founds their right on long possession, which ought not to be disturbed upon slight grounds. His difficulty is as to the right still in some measure belonging to that unfortunate family. In short, he is dubious, and he would not involve the nation in a civil war to restore the Stuarts. Nay, I have heard him say he was so dubious that if holding up his right hand would have gained the victory to the Highland army in 1745, he does not know if he would have done it. Boswell observed that this argument settles his mind. I think it is the argument that settled Edward Waverley's mind too, and, if I may venture it, Walter Scott's. At the end of Waverley, Prince Charles is in France, and the attention is on the sufferings of his followers left behind, symbolized by the death of Fergus MacIvor and Evan Dhu for high treason. The description of the death of Fergus, which took place in Carlisle, draws on accounts of the execution of the Jacobite lords in London in 1746, the most public of the government's reprisals. Lord Balmerino on Tower Hill had replied to the governor's "God bless King George" with "God bless King James." Fergus MacIvor's last words are "God save King James." He is thinking of his Jacobite loyalty. But surely the reader is thinking of him, his henchmen, and the 6 or the very best of his clan who would be willing to be justified in his stead. We have some insight into what happened to his followers when Dougal Mahony turns up in Edinburgh after Culloden, with one of his arms cut off, a sair clewer in the head, and begging for something to eat. At the end of the novel, there is much stress on the restoration of Tully Veolan. It was a Jacobite house, but in the Perthshire lowlands. We are not told what happened to Glennaquoich, the Jacobite house in the Highlands. At the end of Waverley, the novel seems to be trying to hold desolation at bay. The subtext is the conquest of Highland Scotland. The destruction of Highland Scotland becomes another myth, a myth as much challenged by historians as the Jacobite myth. The defeat of Highland culture, as told by Scott, becomes another paradigmatic story. It tells how Scotland comes to be as it is. And its further diagnostic power was illustrated in Scott's own day in Napoleon's conquests, and subsequently in the destruction of many traditional cultures right up to the present. The theme of the destruction of a traditional culture is probably the single most common theme in post-colonial literatures. In the case of Jacobitism, history seems to have fallen into the mould of myth. In the case of Highland Scotland, myth seems to have been distilled out of history. Ultimately, Waverley is not a Jacobite book, but nor is it a Whig one. Scott's stance is that of a post-Jacobite Tory, I think. In terms of Jacobitism, it would have been possible to present the hope of restoration, giving way to the hope of return, and that return endlessly deferred. But Scott was neither royalist nor nostalgic enough to be a Jacobite. If one is tempted to think that a book that is not Jacobite must be Whig, it is instructive to read the early reviews of Waverley by the Whig reviewers, with their assumption that the changes in Highland society since 1745 were part of the natural order of things. The destruction of Scotland remained a preoccupation for Scott all his life, whether it was the destruction of the culture of the Highlands, or of the borders, or of Scottish nationhood. It is commonly said that Shakespeare in his history plays creates a myth of England. Scott creates a myth of Scotland. Any incipient triumphalism in either is subverted by the memory of defeats and compromises. At the end of Waverley, the Jacobite myth is superseded by the slightly different one, the myth of Highland Scotland. The reader's attention is dominated at the end by the marriage of Waverley and Rose and the accompanying symbols of concord and restitution. But when the mind escapes from the wedding party, what does it think of? Not, surely, of Charles Edward or Flora Macdonald even in France, but of the death of Fergus MacIver and the defeated Highlanders. The defeat of Jacobitism is the occasion of that loss. It is not in itself the loss.